She was going to die on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesdays had significance in the Valith sovereignty's royal calendar. Not because the beings who had arranged her death had chosen the day for any reason beyond operational convenience, but because the convoy carrying Queen Sira Valith I, youngest sovereign in the sovereignty's 400-year history, was passing through the Kethar transit corridor on a Tuesday morning, and the ambush had been planned around the convoy schedule, and the convoy schedule said Tuesday, and so Tuesday was when it happened. She was 20 years old. She had been queen for 11 months, elevated to the throne when her mother died of an illness that the royal physicians had not caught in time, and that the sovereignty's political opposition had, in the 11 months since, been loudly insisting was not an illness at all. She had spent those 11 months learning the job under conditions that made learning the job significantly harder than it would otherwise have been. Navigating a court that was divided between the factions that wanted to support her and the factions that wanted to replace her with someone more convenient. Conducting diplomatic functions that required the composure of someone twice her age. Making decisions about a civilization of 400 million people with the advisors available to her. Which were the advisors who had survived the political purging that the opposition faction had conducted in the weeks following her mother's death. She had done all of it, every piece of it, not gracefully, not without mistakes, not with the polished ease of someone who had been trained for the throne from birth rather than elevated to it in crisis. With the specific stubborn competence of someone who understood that the alternative to doing the job imperfectly was not doing the job at all, and not doing the job at all was not something she was able to choose. The convoy was 6 vessels, her personal transport, 4 escort ships, and a diplomatic support vessel carrying her staff for the trade summit on Vethara station that was the official reason for the transit. The escort ships were good. The crews were loyal. The defensive systems were current. They were not current enough. The ambush was 17 ships. The opposition faction had been building toward this for 8 months and had done it carefully, had acquired vessels through proxies and intermediaries, and the specific patient accumulation of capability that required resources and time, and the willingness to commit to an outcome completely enough to spend both. 17 ships, positioned at the transit corridor's narrowest gravitational point, where the convoy's maneuverability was most constrained, timed to the convoy's schedule which had been leaked from inside the royal court by someone. The Queen's Security Division had not yet identified and would not have time to identify before Tuesday. The ambush began at 8:40. By 8:43, 2 of the 4 escort ships were disabled. By 8:47, the 3rd escort ship was gone. By 8:51, the 4th escort ship had placed itself between the Queen's transport and the ambush fleet, and was fighting the mathematics of 17 against 1 with everything it had, which was significant and not sufficient. In the Queen's transport, her chief of security, a veteran named Thal who had served the royal house for 20 years and who was currently doing the most difficult thing his 20 years had required of him, which was telling the Queen the truth about the situation, said, "We have approximately 9 minutes before the escort is gone and we are next." The Queen looked at him. She was 20 years old and she had spent 11 months learning that the people around her sometimes told her what they thought she wanted to hear, and that finding the ones who told her the truth was the most important thing she could do with any power she had. Thal was one of the ones who told her the truth. She said options. He said, "We run. We cannot outrun them. We send a distress signal. Help is 40 minutes away at minimum. We negotiate. The opposition faction's objective is not negotiation." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Send the signal anyway." He sent it. The signal went out on the emergency frequency, the standard sovereignty distress protocol, broadcasting the convoy's position and status, and the nature of the threat on every band simultaneously, which was what the protocol required and which produced, in the monitoring systems of every vessel within range, an alert that was impossible to miss, and that each vessel receiving it processed according to its own protocols and priorities. Most of the vessels that received it were not in a position to help. One was. The UN Ardent Grace was not a warship. It was a survey vessel, Earth Registry, assigned to a long-range mapping program that had been running for 3 years, and that had brought it to the edge of the Cathar Transit Corridor on a Tuesday morning, because the survey program's schedule said this region on this date. And the survey program's schedule, unlike the Queen's convoy schedule, had not been leaked to anyone. The Ardent Grace had a crew of 22. It was armed in the minimal way that Earth survey vessels were armed, because survey vessels operated in regions where being unarmed was a specific category of foolish, which was to say it had 2 defensive weapon systems and 1 offensive system that the crew referred to as the Argument Ender, which was a name that reflected both its capability and the philosophy of its use. The commanding officer of the Ardent Grace was a man named Captain Demi Akafer, who was 38 years old and had been running survey missions for Earth's Exploration Division for 9 years, and who received the distress signal at 8:53 while reviewing the previous day's mapping data, and who looked at it for approximately 4 seconds before he was on his feet and moving. His navigator said, "We are 12 minutes out at maximum speed." His tactical officer said, 17 contacts engaging a convoy, 1 escort remaining. The convoy's primary vessel is the Valith Sovereignty's Royal Transport. His chief engineer said, "Maximum speed is going to cost us the secondary drive manifold." Akafer said, "Then we replace it, all power to drive, get me that 12 minutes. His crew moved. The Ardent Grace moved with them. Inside the Queen's transport, Thal was watching the remaining escort fight 17 ships, and doing the math that the math said was inevitable, and had the expression of someone doing math whose result they already know, but that they are doing anyway because the doing is the last thing available to do. The Queen was watching too. She was 20 years old and she had been told the truth, and the truth was 9 minutes, and she was sitting with it the way that some people sat with bad things and some people did not. Not numb. Not dissociated, present with it, holding it clearly, thinking. She said the distress signal. Did anyone receive it? Thal said yes, multiple vessel, none within useful range. She said none. He said the closest vessel is an Earth survey ship, 12 minutes out. It is not a warship. She looked at him. He said it cannot change the situation. She looked at her hands for a moment. She said, "What is it doing?" Thal checked the tracking, looked at the Ardent Grace's course and speed. He said, "It is coming anyway." The Queen looked at the display. At the small survey vessel burning everything it had across 12 minutes of space toward a situation that it could not change. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What is the crew?" Thal said 22, Earth Survey Division. 22 people, she thought, coming anyway. At 8:59, 6 minutes after receiving the distress signal, the Ardent Grace entered the combat zone. It did not enter the way warships entered combat zones. It entered the way a survey vessel entered a region it had been built to map, which was to say it entered with its sensors running full, and its systems configured for data collection, and its crew doing what 22 people who had been running survey missions for years did when they arrived somewhere new, which was to immediately and completely understand the geometry of where they were. The geometry of where they were was 17 warships in a specific formation, engaging 2 remaining vessels of the Sovereignty convoy, with the Queen's transport at the far end of the engagement envelope, trying to maximize the distance between itself and the ambush fleet within the gravitational constraints of the corridor. Captain Akafer looked at the geometry. He had 9 years of survey experience, 9 years of mapping regions that nobody had mapped before, of reading gravitational fields and spatial geometry the way other people read text, of understanding the three-dimensional structure of environments at a glance, and identifying what mattered and what did not and what could be used. He looked at the geometry for 11 seconds. Then he said, "I need a channel to the convoy's command." The channel opened in 3 seconds. He said, "This is Captain Demi Akafer, UEN Ardent Grace. I am a survey vessel. I have 12 people in weapon stations and 10 running the drives. I need you to do exactly what I tell you for the next 4 minutes, and I need you to do it immediately when I tell you." The voice that came back was young, female, carrying something that Akafer, who had spent 9 years in the field, recognized as the specific quality of someone sitting with a bad situation and thinking clearly inside it. She said, "I am listening." He said, "In 40 seconds your transport needs to move to the coordinates I am transmitting. Exactly those coordinates. Not close. Exactly." She said, "Those coordinates put us deeper into the corridor." He said, "Yes." She said, "That reduces our maneuverability." He said, "Yes. It also puts you inside the gravitational shadow of the corridor's central mass body, which the ambush fleet cannot enter without reforming their firing geometry, which takes 90 seconds, which is what I need." A pause brief. She said, "My security chief says that is correct." He said, "Move in 30 seconds." She said, "Moving in 30 seconds." She moved in 30 seconds. The ambush fleet's formation began reforming immediately, because 17 ships that had been positioned for a specific engagement geometry needed 90 seconds to adjust when the target moved unexpectedly, and 90 seconds was the window. Akafer used 87 of them. What he did in 87 seconds was what 9 years of reading spatial geometry had built him to do, which was to look at an environment and find the thing that was not obvious. The thing that the ambush fleet's positioning assumed did not matter. The thing that was there, in the corridor's structure, in the gravitational body's shadow, in the specific configuration of mass and space that the corridor's natural architecture created, that had not been part of the ambush fleet's planning, because the ambush fleet's planning was military planning, and military planning looked at tactical geometry, and not at the kind of geometry that 9 years of survey work produced in a person. The corridor had a resonance point. Not a weapons system, not a tactical asset, a natural feature, a location in the corridor where the gravitational fields of the central mass body and the 2 flanking bodies intersected in a specific configuration that produced, for a vessel that knew where to be and what to emit, an amplified signal effect, a natural amplifier. A survey vessel's primary function was signal emission. Mapping required broadcasting ranging signals and reading returns. The Ardent Grace's signal systems were not weapons. They were the most sophisticated non-weapon signal systems that Earth built because mapping required them to be. At the resonance point, broadcasting at maximum power, the Ardent Grace's survey signals became something that the ambush fleet sensor systems experienced as a full combat-grade jamming field covering the entire corridor. Not because the Ardent Grace had a jamming system. Because a survey vessel at a resonance point broadcasting mapping signals at maximum power produced the same effect through physics rather than weaponry. And the ambush fleet sensor operators, looking at their boards at the results, could not tell the difference between a combat jamming system and physics that produced the same output. And the 90 seconds of formation reform became 160 seconds of formation reform, because 160 seconds was how long it took to reform around a jamming field that was actually not a jamming field, but that looked exactly like one. 160 seconds. Into which Akafer broadcast on the open frequency that he had been transmitting to the Queen's transport. "Move now. Heading I am sending, maximum speed, do not stop." The transport moved. The last escort moved with it, damaged and running on partial systems, running anyway. They cleared the corridor engagement envelope at the 153rd second. The ambush fleet completed its formation reform at the 161st second, and found the geometry of the corridor, and the gravitational constraints, and the position of the ardent grace at the resonance point, and the exit heading of the Queen's transport, and the 8 seconds of margin that Akafar had found in the geometry of a corridor that he had been looking at for 87 seconds with 9 years of training in looking at corridors. 8 seconds. The ambush fleet pursued. The ardent grace did not pursue with the convoy. The ardent grace held the resonance point and kept broadcasting, because the moment it stopped broadcasting the jamming field collapsed, and the ambush fleet's sensors cleared, and the 8 seconds became 0 seconds, and 8 seconds was the margin and 8 seconds had to be held. The ardent grace held it. For 4 minutes it held the resonance point and broadcast at maximum power, and absorbed what the ambush fleet sent at it in return for the broadcasting, which was weapons fire from 17 warships directed at a survey vessel with 2 defensive systems, and 1 offensive system that the crew called the argument ender. And what the argument ender argued when Akafar finally used it at minute 3 was with the ambush fleet's lead vessel in a way that produced enough structural concern in that vessel to cause the lead vessel to pull back, which caused the formation to adjust around the lead vessel pulling back, which produced 12 more seconds. 12 seconds plus 4 minutes plus 8 seconds. The convoy reached the corridor exit with a margin that thou, running the numbers in the Queen's transport, described to the Queen as the most precise piece of spatial navigation he had seen in 20 years of security work. The Queen looked at the display showing the ardent grace behind them at the resonance point, taking fire from 17 ships, holding the point. She said, "Get me a channel." The channel opened. She said, "Captain Akafar, get out of there." His voice came back with the quality that she had heard in it from the first transmission, the quality of someone who had decided what they were doing and was doing it. He said, "Working on it." She said, "Now, Captain." He said, "Your Majesty, with respect, the argument is not finished." She looked at the display. She said, "What argument?" He said, "The one about whether 17 ships can hold a position that 1 survey vessel is occupying. It is a question of geometry, and I believe I have it for another 90 seconds. She said, "Captain." He said, 90 seconds. Then I am done arguing and I am leaving." She watched the display for 90 seconds. Then the ardent grace left the resonance point. The jamming field collapsed. The ambush fleet sensors cleared. The corridor was empty. The convoy was gone. The Queen's transport and the damaged escort and a survey vessel with a crew of 22 were 3 minutes outside the corridor, and the ambush fleet was looking at an empty corridor, and the geometry of a pursuit that the gravitational constraints made unattractive. They did not pursue. The ardent grace pulled alongside the Queen's transport 20 minutes later, and Thal docked them at the secondary bay, because the primary bay had taken damage in the last minute of the engagement and was offline. Akafar came through the docking connection with 2 members of his crew who were the ardent grace's medical officers, because the first thing he had thought about when the engagement ended was whether anyone on the convoy was hurt, which was not the first thing that most people thought about after surviving what the last 4 minutes had been. The Queen met him at the docking connection. She was 20 years old and she had spent 4 minutes watching a survey vessel with 22 crew hold a resonance point against 17 warships, because the geometry said it could be held for 4 minutes, and 4 minutes was what the convoy had needed. She looked at him. He was 38 and had 9 years of field experience, and the specific quality of someone who had just done something that required everything they had, and was now attending to what came next. She said, "Are your crew all right?" He looked at her. The question had not been what he expected. He had been ready for the question of why, or how, or what you are doing in this corridor, or any of the questions that a 20-year-old queen who had just survived an assassination attempt might reasonably ask the person who had arrived in a survey vessel and done what he had done. She had asked about his crew. He said 2 injuries, not critical, my medical officers are attending to them. She said my medical staff will assist, please. He said thank you. She said Captain Okafor, you came. He looked at her for a moment. He said you sent a signal. She said I was told you could not change the situation. He said the geometry disagreed. She looked at him for a long time. She said you could have not come. You had 22 crew. This was not your situation. You are a survey vessel. He said you sent a signal. She heard it the second time, heard the completeness of it, the way it contained everything and needed nothing added to it. You sent a signal and we came because you sent a signal, and coming when signals are sent is what we do. And the math of whether we could change the situation was the geometry's math to answer, and not ours to decide before we got there. She was 20 years old and she had been queen for 11 months, and she had learned in 11 months to hear the thing underneath the words because the thing underneath was usually the true thing, and the words were usually the form of the true thing. She heard the thing underneath. She said, I would like to speak with your crew, all of them if they are willing. He said, they would be honored, Your Majesty. She said, I would be the honored one. She meant it. He could tell. He said, I know. The diplomatic aftermath took 6 weeks. The ambush fleet's origin was traced. The leak inside the royal court was identified. The opposition faction's leadership was brought before the sovereignty's judicial process with the evidence that Thal's investigation produced, and that the conclave's intelligence division supported with the records their monitoring had captured of the engagement. The Queen navigated it, imperfectly, with mistakes, with the specific stubborn competence of someone who was doing the job because not doing it was not a choice she was able to make. At the end of 6 weeks, in the quiet of the first week that had not been consumed by immediate crisis, she did something that the sovereignty's court had not seen a ruling monarch do in 400 years of royal history. She traveled to Earth. Not on official diplomatic business, not with the full apparatus of a state visit, with a small staff and a security detail and the particular quality of someone who had decided that there was a thing she needed to do and was doing it. She went to the Earth Exploration Division Survey Operations Center, and she asked to meet the crew of the Ardent Grace, who were between missions, who were in the building when she arrived because Okafor had called ahead, and told them a visitor was coming and who assembled in the operations center's main room with the uncertainty of 22 people, who had been told a queen was coming to see them, and were not sure what that meant. She walked in. She looked at 22 people who had been in a survey vessel 4 minutes from a corridor where she had been going to die on a Tuesday morning. She said, I want to thank each of you individually, and I want to know your names. Your real names, not your titles or your ranks, what the people who know you call you. She started on the left and she went around the room, and she asked each person their name, and she listened when they told her, and she said something specific to each one, something that Thal, watching from the side of the room, would later describe in his personal notes as evidence that the Queen had not spent the 6 weeks of diplomatic aftermath in the abstraction of the situation, but in the specific reality of what 22 particular people had done on a particular Tuesday morning. When she reached Okafor, she stopped. She said, You told me the geometry disagreed. He said it did. She said, How did you know? He said, 9 years of looking at geometry. She said, And if the geometry had not disagreed, if the math had worked out the way my chief of security said it would. He looked at her steadily. He said, We would have come anyway. She looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you sent a signal." She heard it the third time. The third time it landed in the place where things landed when they were completely true, and you had heard them enough times to stop hearing just the words. You sent a signal, and we came because that is what we do when signals are sent, and the geometry is the geometry's problem, not ours. She was 20 years old and she had been queen for 11 months, and she had learned in 11 months what it meant to be surrounded by people who told you what they thought you wanted to hear. She knew what it felt like to hear the truth. She stood in the Earth Exploration Division's Operations Center and looked at 22 people who had come because a signal was sent, and she thought about what it meant that this was true, that this was simply true, that a survey vessel with 22 crew received a distress signal, and came and found the geometry and held the resonance point and asked, "Are your crew all right?" And that none of this was exceptional for them, that this was Tuesday. She thought about what a galaxy full of civilizations looked like when one of them was like this. She thought it looked different than it had before Tuesday. She thought she was going to spend the rest of her reign figuring out what to do with that difference. She thought she should start by saying the thing she had come to say. She said, "My people are alive because you came. I am alive because you came. I will not forget that. My civilization will not forget that. And I want you to know, all of you, that what you did is not invisible, that it is seen, that I see it." The room was quiet. Then Akafar said, "Your Majesty, we have the next survey mission scheduled for Thursday. Would you like to see what we found in the corridor on Tuesday? The geometry of it is actually remarkable." She looked at him. She said yes. She sat with them for 3 hours and looked at the geometry of a corridor that had almost been where she died, and that had instead been where she learned something about a species and what they did when signals were sent. And she looked at it with the attention of someone who was going to carry it. She carried it for the rest of her reign. Every time a signal was sent, she remembered the geometry. Every time she had to decide whether to come, anyway, she heard the thing underneath the words. She came anyway. Every time. She had learned it from a survey vessel with 22 crew on a Tuesday morning. She never forgot where she learned it.